A man walks into an authorized Rolex dealer with the full retail price of a steel Daytona sitting ready in his account. No financing needed, no negotiation required, just the number the dealer itself has printed. He's told, politely, that none are in stock and that his name can be added to a list. He asks how long the list typically takes. The salesperson hesitates, then says something close to, honestly, it could be years. And for this specific model, some clients never actually reach the front of it at all. Here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. Rolex, by every industry estimate, manufactures roughly 1 million watches a year, one of the largest production volumes of any Swiss watchmaker on earth, and still cannot come close to satisfying demand for a handful of its most iconic models. Watches the company has had, for decades, the proven manufacturing capability to produce in significantly larger numbers than it currently does. This isn't a supply chain failure. It isn't a temporary shortage caused by some unusual disruption. It is, according to Rolex's own documented corporate structure and the testimony of authorized dealers across the industry, a deliberate, permanent business decision. And once you understand why a company would choose to leave that much money on the table year after year, you'll understand exactly why the watch on your wrist, if it's a Rolex at all, likely required something closer to a courtship than a transaction to obtain. I'm going to tell you why Rolex makes its most desirable watches so genuinely difficult to buy, and I promise you the real answer is one of the strangest, most quietly disciplined stories in modern luxury manufacturing. Here's what's ahead. I'm going to walk you through the unusual corporate structure that makes Rolex almost unique among major companies, ownership by a private foundation with no shareholders demanding quarterly growth, and why that structure is the single biggest reason the scarcity strategy has survived unbroken for generations. We'll break down the informal system authorized dealers use to decide who actually gets offered a hot watch, sometimes called the list, and the specific unwritten rules that determine whether you'll ever move up it. I'll show you what happens to a Rolex the moment it leaves the store, why certain steel sports models regularly resell for 2, sometimes 3 times their original retail price within days, and why that resale premium is not an accident the company is embarrassed about, but a number it watches closely. And by the end, you'll understand why getting turned away from buying a watch you could easily afford isn't Rolex failing to run an efficient business. It's Rolex running one of the most quietly effective scarcity strategies in the history of consumer goods, and doing it on purpose every single year by design. Think of Rolex's production line the way you'd think of a dam holding back a reservoir that's been rising for decades, capable, structurally, of releasing far more water than it currently does, but deliberately kept at a fraction of full capacity because the company controlling the dam understands something crucial. The value of everything downstream depends entirely on the water remaining scarce. Most manufacturers build a dam and open it as wide as demand justifies because more units moving through the gate means more revenue captured today. Rolex has operated its dam differently for the better part of a century, releasing a carefully calibrated flow, never quite enough to satisfy the reservoir of demand building up behind it, because a permanently full reservoir, one where anyone downstream can access as much water as they want whenever they want it, is a reservoir that stops being worth protecting, stops being worth waiting for, and stops carrying the specific kind of value that comes only from things people cannot simply walk in and obtain. There's a piece of the story almost nobody outside the watch industry actually knows, and it explains why Rolex has been able to run this strategy with a level of discipline that would be almost impossible for most publicly traded companies to sustain. Rolex is not owned by shareholders in any conventional sense. The company is owned by the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, a private trust established by Rolex's own founder before his death, specifically structured so that the company's profits fund the foundation's charitable and horological activities rather than flowing to external investors demanding quarterly earnings growth. This structural detail matters enormously to everything else in this story, because a typical publicly traded luxury company answers to shareholders who generally want to see revenue and unit sales, climbing every single reporting period, creating constant pressure to expand production and capture every available sale sitting in front of the business. Rolex, structurally, faces none of that pressure. There is no earnings call where an analyst can ask Rolex's leadership why they didn't simply build and sell more Daytonas last quarter to satisfy obvious overwhelming demand. and no shareholder base that can vote out a board for prioritizing long-term brand discipline over short-term volume. This unusual ownership structure is precisely why watch industry analysts have consistently pointed to Rolex as one of the very few major manufacturers with the genuine institutional freedom to leave billions of dollars in immediately available demand permanently unmet year after year, without ever facing the kind of internal pressure that would eventually force a normal corporation to loosen the taps. Here's the production number that makes this concrete. Industry estimates, since Rolex itself famously does not publish detailed production figures, place the company's annual output somewhere around 1 million watches, a genuinely enormous number by Swiss watchmaking standards, dwarfing the production volumes of most other prestige brands in the same general tier. And yet, for a specific handful of steel sports models, the Daytona, certain Submariner and GMT Master references, demand has remained so far beyond available supply for so many consecutive years that authorized dealers across the world have, at various points, simply stopped maintaining public waiting lists at all for the most in-demand references, because the list had effectively become meaningless, stretching years into the future with no realistic estimate of when a specific name might actually receive an offer. Rolex has a demonstrated manufacturing capability, the global supply chain, and by every account, the raw consumer appetite to produce meaningfully more units of these specific references than it currently does. It simply doesn't. And unlike many companies caught in a similar position, Rolex's leadership has never publicly framed this as a problem the company is working urgently to solve. How this scarcity actually gets managed on the ground matters too, because a permanent worldwide shortage doesn't distribute itself randomly, and Rolex has built an entire informal infrastructure, largely operated through its authorized dealer network rather than directly by the corporate parent, to manage exactly who gets access. This is where the story moves from abstract strategy into something collectors and prospective buyers experience directly. And it centers on what's informally known throughout the watch collecting world simply as the list. Rolex authorized dealers maintain their own internal records of client purchase history, relationship depth, and what the industry sometimes calls purchase loyalty, meaning how much a given client has spent with that specific dealer across other, more readily available models before ever being offered a chance at one of the genuinely scarce references. Multiple watch collectors and industry journalists have documented repeatedly over the years a widely understood, unwritten expectation that a first-time customer walking in and asking specifically for a steel Daytona with no prior purchase history at that dealership is exceptionally unlikely to be offered one, regardless of ability to pay, while a client who has purchased several other Rolex models, attended dealer events, and built a multi-year relationship with a specific salesperson stands a meaningfully better chance of eventually being called when an allocation becomes available. Let me give you a short scene to make this concrete, close to how collectors have described these conversations happening in real dealerships around the world. A buyer walks in, asks about a specific steel sports model everyone's heard is nearly impossible to find, and the salesperson doesn't say no outright. The response tends to land somewhere closer to, that particular reference is extremely limited, we receive very few pieces each month, and allocation is something we manage carefully for our long-term clients. Translated out of the polite phrasing, the buyer understands the unspoken instruction embedded in that sentence perfectly well by now, because the story has become common enough knowledge across the collecting community that it's practically folklore. Go buy something else first. A dress watch, a more available sports model, anything that establishes a purchase history and a relationship with this specific store. Come back in a year, then another year after that. And eventually, if the relationship has been built patiently enough, the offer might arrive. Rolex Corporate itself has generally stayed publicly quiet on the specifics of how individual dealers manage this allocation, framing it as a matter left to each authorized retailer's own client relationships, which conveniently keeps the company's own hands appearing clean of the more uncomfortable optics involved in openly gatekeeping access based on unrelated prior spending, while still benefiting enormously from a system that keeps demand permanently, visibly unmet. Here's the psychological mechanism running underneath this entire structure, and it's one of the most consistently documented findings in behavioral economics. There's a well-established concept called the scarcity heuristic. demonstrated repeatedly across decades of consumer research, showing that limited availability doesn't simply fail to reduce desire for an object, it actively increases it because human beings use scarcity itself as a shortcut signal for quality and value, particularly in categories where the underlying quality is genuinely difficult to evaluate directly. A stainless steel watch, mechanically, however well engineered, is not an object whose functional performance most buyers can meaningfully assess on sight, the way you might judge the acceleration of a car or the fabric quality of a jacket. What a buyer can assess instantly and viscerally is how hard the object was to obtain, and Rolex's entire allocation system, whether or not it was consciously designed around this specific research, functions as an extraordinarily effective scarcity signal, converting a watch's difficulty of purchase into a form of value that the object's stainless steel case and in-house movement, remarkable as they are, could never fully generate on their own. What happens to these watches the moment they actually leave the store is where the strategy's financial logic becomes undeniable rather than theoretical. The secondary market for Rolex sports watches has become one of the most closely tracked, most data-rich resale markets in all of consumer goods, with platforms like Chrono24 and Watch Charts publishing real-time pricing data pulled from thousands of actual transactions across the global gray market. A steel Daytona purchased at Rolex's official retail price has, for years running, consistently resold on the secondary market at a significant premium above that retail number, in some periods running well over double the original price, sometimes considerably more for specific dial variants. Collectors particularly covet certain references of the Submariner and the GMT Master, nicknamed within the community for their distinctive bezel colors, have shown similarly persistent premiums, occasionally spiking even higher during periods of unusually strong demand. This isn't an occasional anomaly limited to one unusually hyped reference. It's been a structural, years-long feature of the market for Rolex's most desirable sports models. And watch industry analysts have been explicit in interviews and trade coverage that Rolex's own leadership monitors this gray market pricing data closely, treating it as one of the clearest available signals of exactly how far below true market clearing price the company's own official retail pricing cites, and by extension, exactly how much of an incentive structure the allocation system is creating for authorized dealers and well-connected buyers alike. There's a related historical episode worth knowing because it shows the allocation system's roots go back further than the recent gray market boom most casual observers assume started it all. Long before Chrono24 or Watch Charts existed to publish real-time secondary market data, the informal dealer allocation system for Rolex sports models was already well established, with collectors describing similar dynamics of relationship-based access, dating back decades, particularly around the introduction of certain now legendary vintage references in the 1960s and 1970s. What changed more recently isn't the underlying mechanism, which has arguably operated in some form for most of the modern company's history, but the visibility of it since resale platforms and online collector communities have made the gap between retail and resale price a matter of public, constantly updated record in a way it simply never was before the internet existed, turning what was once a quiet, insider dynamic known mainly to serious collectors into something visible to essentially anyone who searches a model name online, which has, if anything, intensified public demand even further by making the scarcity itself impossible to ignore. Here's the uncomfortable layer this reveals, and it's worth being direct about it, because it explains a meaningful amount of frustration inside the collecting community. If a watch purchased at official retail can be resold within days for 2 or 3 times that price, a genuinely powerful financial incentive exists for anyone positioned to receive an allocation to simply flip it immediately rather than keep it. And multiple industry reports and first-hand collector accounts have described exactly this happening at scale, sometimes involving dealership staff themselves securing allocations for friends and family specifically to resell into the gray market for a quick, essentially risk-free profit. Rolex has, at various points, taken visible steps to discourage this specific behavior, reportedly monitoring which clients appear to be flipping watches shortly after purchase and reducing or eliminating future allocation to buyers identified as doing so, treating a fast resale, much like Ferrari does with its own limited models, as a violation of the unwritten relationship a genuine collector is expected to maintain with the brand, even when no explicit contractual line has technically been crossed. The message embedded in that enforcement is consistent with everything else in this story. Rolex isn't simply trying to sell watches, it's trying to protect a very specific, carefully maintained gap between retail price and resale value, because that gap is doing an enormous amount of quiet marketing work for the brand, functioning as visible, constantly updated proof, refreshed daily on public resale platforms. That owning one of these watches means owning something the broader market values considerably more than what you paid. There's a psychological mechanism layered on top of the scarcity heuristic worth naming directly, because it explains why the wait produces such devoted, rather than simply frustrated, customers. Behavioral research on what's called effort justification has repeatedly found that people who endure a difficult, drawn out process to obtain something end up valuing that thing significantly more than people who receive an identical item with no friction involved at all, because the mind resists the discomfort of believing it endured years of relationship building and patience for nothing. A collector who spent 3 years buying other models, showing up at dealer events, and building a relationship with a specific salesperson before finally being offered a steal. Daytona doesn't experience that watch as an object they were merely permitted to purchase. They experience it as something earned, and that earned framing produces a depth of brand loyalty and emotional attachment that simply walking in and buying the watch off a shelf could never generate. Rolex isn't just restricting supply, the waiting itself is quietly converting ordinary customers into some of the most devoted brand advocates in all of consumer goods. Individuals who will happily explain, unprompted, exactly how long they waited and what they did to finally earn their allocation, turning years of imposed friction into a story they tell with genuine pride rather than resentment. Comparing Rolex's approach to how other prestige watchmakers handle the same underlying pressure reveals just how deliberately Rolex's specific strategy has been calibrated. Patek Philippe, Izwik Asankuig, widely regarded as sitting even further up the prestige ladder than Rolex, runs an allocation system that's, if anything, even more restrictive and relationship dependent, particularly for its most sought-after steel sports references, where waiting periods measured in years and deep purchase history requirements are, by collector accounts, standard practice rather than exceptional. Patek has famously built an entire decades-long advertising campaign around the idea that you never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation, explicitly reframing the purchase itself as something closer to inherited stewardship than ordinary consumer transaction, a messaging strategy that reinforces exactly the same scarcity and legacy value the allocation system is simultaneously creating through supply restriction. Audemars Piguet runs a similarly tight allocation system for its Royal Oak sports line, particularly certain steel references that have seen gray market premiums rivaling or exceeding Rolex's own hottest models in recent years. What separates these brands from watchmakers further down the prestige tier, brands that build excellent watches but don't command anywhere near the same resale premiums or waiting list mystique, isn't necessarily a gap in watchmaking quality, since the mechanical engineering conversation across several competing manufacturers is often genuinely close. It's the multi-decade discipline of treating undersupply as a permanent, structural feature of the business rather than a temporary response to unusually strong demand. A discipline that, as we've discussed, Rolex's unique ownership structure makes considerably easier to sustain than it would be for a publicly traded competitor answering to shareholders every quarter. There's a broader economic pattern worth naming here, because it explains why this strategy remains so rare, even though the financial logic behind it is, by now, extremely well documented and widely understood across the luxury industry. Economists sometimes describe this as a company choosing to leave money on the table deliberately, a phrase that sounds irrational on its surface until you understand the actual trade-off being made. Every single year, Rolex chooses not to expand production of its most in-demand references to meet visible, immediate demand. It is mathematically foregoing revenue it could capture right now. Revenue that a normal company's leadership, especially one facing shareholder pressure, would generally feel compelled to capture rather than deliberately forfeit. Rolex's foundation-based ownership structure has allowed the company to consistently choose the smaller number today in exchange for a considerably larger, more durable brand advantage across every future year, a bet that depends entirely on the discipline holding indefinitely, because a single sustained period of chasing volume, of quietly loosening allocation to capture more short-term sales, would risk unwinding a scarcity perception that's taken the better part of a century to build, and that the gray market's constantly updated public pricing data would reveal almost immediately if it ever genuinely started to erode. There's a real cost here and a real thing being protected because there is a defensible argument underneath the scarcity strategy that isn't purely cynical. Rolex has built its reputation not just on exclusivity, but on an unusually rigorous in-house approach to manufacturing, producing the overwhelming majority of its own components internally rather than outsourcing to third-party suppliers the way many competitors do, a vertical integration strategy that genuinely does constrain how quickly production can scale for any given reference, since expanding output of a specific movement or case design requires expanding highly specialized internal manufacturing capacity rather than simply placing a larger order with an external supplier. Some portion of the scarcity is therefore rooted in a real production constraint, not purely a marketing choice. But here's the distinction worth holding on to, because it matters just as much here as it did with every other version of this story. Genuine scarcity comes from a real constraint the company can't simply choose away. Manufactured scarcity is a business decision, and industry analysts, along with several documented statements from Rolex's own leadership over the years, have made clear that the company could, if it chose to, invest further in expanding capacity specifically for its most in-demand references, and has largely chosen a slower, more measured expansion path instead, one explicitly justified around protecting quality control and brand exclusivity rather than purely technical impossibility. The vertical integration argument is real. It simply isn't the whole story. And the persistent, multi-year gray market premium on specific references, premiums that have remained remarkably stable across years of steadily expanding overall Rolex production, suggests the company has calibrated its output specifically to maintain that gap rather than eliminate it. There's a further wrinkle worth understanding before we get to what you can actually do with this information, because it's reshaping how the entire allocation conversation is playing out right now. Rolex's own leadership has, in recent years, taken visible public steps that some industry observers interpret as at least a partial acknowledgement of the tension this system creates, including the introduction of a program allowing Rolex itself, through a small number of authorized boutiques, to buy back and resell certain pre-owned watches with official certification, a move that gives the company a direct sanctioned foothold in a secondary market it had spent decades watching from the outside. Analysts covering the announcement were divided on what it actually signals, some reading it as a first real crack in the traditional scarcity model, an acknowledgement that the gray market had grown too large and too visible to simply ignore. Others reading it as an even more sophisticated extension of the same underlying strategy, giving Rolex a way to capture a slice of the resale premium directly rather than watching it flow entirely to gray market dealers and private sellers. Either interpretation leads back to the same underlying truth. Rolex is not a company that stumbled into scarcity by accident and is now scrambling to manage an unintended consequence. It's a company that has spent decades studying exactly how that scarcity behaves in the real world and continues adjusting its strategy carefully around it, rather than ever simply opening the taps. So, what do you actually do with this information, whether you're someone who genuinely wants to buy one of these watches someday or simply someone who finds the mechanics of the story interesting? First, understand that the allocation system rewards patience and relationship building far more reliably than it rewards simply having the funds ready. And if you're serious about eventually acquiring one of the genuinely scarce references, building a purchase history and a relationship with a specific authorized dealer, buying other models along the way, tends to be the documented, realistic path, not walking in cold and asking for the hardest watch to find in the store. Second, recognize the gray market for exactly what it is: a real, functioning market with genuine price discovery, but one where premiums can compress or even briefly reverse during periods of broader economic uncertainty. Since watch industry data has shown gray market premiums on even the most iconic references fluctuating meaningfully during periods of financial market stress, meaning the resale value isn't a fixed, guaranteed feature of ownership so much as a reflection of currently prevailing collector sentiment. Third, separate your appreciation of the actual object, the engineering, the history, the in-house manufacturing, from the scarcity narrative surrounding it. And ask yourself honestly whether you'd still want a specific reference if it were sitting readily available on a shelf at retail price with no waiting list attached at all. Because if part of the appeal is specifically the difficulty of the acquisition itself, you're responding to the scarcity mechanism as much as to the watch, and that's worth knowing clearly before committing years of patience and relationship building to the pursuit. Fourth, If you're evaluating a purchase specifically as a financial asset rather than purely as an object to wear and enjoy, remember that gray market premiums, while remarkably persistent for decades on certain references, are not a fixed law of the market, and a strategy built entirely around scarcity remains, by definition, vulnerable to the exact kind of shift in company policy, the pre-owned certification program among them, that could gradually narrow the very gap the investment case depends on, meaning the safest way to value one of these watches is still as something you'd be genuinely happy to own and wear even if the resale premium quietly disappeared tomorrow. Here's the identity level point I want you to leave with. Rolex turning away a customer with cash in hand isn't the company failing at basic retail logic. It's one of the most disciplined, most consistently sustained scarcity strategies in all of consumer goods, made possible by an ownership structure almost no other major manufacturer shares. A private foundation with no shareholders, demanding quarterly volume growth, free to make the same patient calculation year after year that a publicly traded rival would almost certainly abandon under pressure. The waiting list, the dealer relationship requirements, the visible, publicly tracked gray market premium, none of it is accidental and none of it is really a judgment on you personally as a buyer. It's the visible surface of a mathematical relationship between scarcity and value that Rolex has protected for the better part of a century and has shown no sign across decades of overwhelming, well-documented demand of ever choosing to trade away. Here are your 3 takeaways. 1. Rolex's scarcity is sustained by an unusually rare corporate structure. Private ownership through the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, which removes the shareholder pressure that would push almost any other major manufacturer to expand production and capture the enormous unmet demand sitting visibly in front of the business every single year. 2. Access to the most desirable references is managed through an informal but very real allocation system built on dealer relationships and purchase history, meaning ability to pay is frequently not sufficient on its own. And the documented path for serious buyers runs through patience and loyalty rather than simply showing up with the money in hand. 3. The persistent, publicly tracked gray market premium on Rolex's hottest models isn't an embarrassing side effect the company is trying to eliminate. It's a visible, constantly refreshed proof point. The entire scarcity strategy depends on and understanding that turns a frustrating rejection at the dealer counter into something far more legible, a company that has run this exact calculation for generations and has consistently decided that saying no today protects something worth considerably more than the sale it's turning down. The next time you hear about someone with the money ready being turned away from a watch counter, you'll know exactly what you're looking at. Not a company that doesn't want the business. A company that has run the numbers for the better part of 100 years, protected by an ownership structure that lets it think in decades instead of quarters, and decided deliberately every single year that the no is worth more than the yes, because the entire value of every Rolex that will ever be sold depends on that no remaining credible. If this changed the way you'll look at the next waiting list you run into, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.